Cold steel pressed against the sovereign's delicate throat. Death was milliseconds away. Any normal bodyguard would have begged, bargained, frozen solid in terror. Instead, her human protector lowered his gaze, tilted his head back, and erupted into genuine, booming laughter. You will not believe what this human did next. 6 hours earlier, in a windowless briefing room 3 decks below the Grand Concourse, Jonathan Miller had stood at parade rest, while a woman in a Terran intelligence uniform walked him through a threat assessment that ran to 400 pages. Odds of an attempt on the Queen's life tonight, the analyst said, not looking up from her tablet, sit somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending on how much you trust Zyron parliamentary chatter, which, historically, is not very much. And my odds of stopping it? Better than anyone else's. That's why you're the one standing in that ballroom instead of a platoon. She finally looked up. Minister Harlan has liquidated 3 off-world holdings in the last 2 weeks, quietly, through cutouts. We don't have a smoking gun yet, but we have a very strong smell of smoke. So we let him walk in there tonight. We let him walk in there tonight, she confirmed, because the moment we arrest a sitting minister of the High Council on a hunch, we hand the conservative faction exactly the martyr they've been praying for. Harlan doesn't get arrested until he's holding the knife, metaphorically or otherwise. Jonathan had nodded once, filed the number away next to 100 other numbers from 100 other assignments, and gone to put on his suit. He hadn't mentioned the conversation to Cassandra. There hadn't been a version of that conversation that would have let her walk into her own gala with the same composure she needed to survive it. Some burdens a bodyguard carried so his principal didn't have to. That was, as far as Jonathan was concerned, most of the job description nobody bothered writing down. Soft orchestral music masked the deadly political undercurrents swirling through the Grand Concourse of Geneva Orbital. Suspended in the cold, starlit void between Earth and the Moon, the station served as neutral ground for the galaxy's most powerful factions. The one patch of territory no empire dared claim, because every empire needed it too badly. Tonight, the concourse glittered. Thousands of floating luminescent spheres drifted just beneath the vaulted ceiling, casting a slow, golden light across a floor of polished obsidian that mirrored the stars outside the viewport like a second sky underfoot. Diplomats in silk, chitin plate, and liquid metal formalwear moved through the crowd in careful orbits of their own, trading smiles that meant nothing and words that meant everything. Queen Cassandra of the Zyron hegemony stood near the great observation window, her spine perfectly straight, her expression a masterwork of practiced serenity. Her species was humanoid enough for effortless integration into Terran high society, 2 arms, 2 legs, a face built for expression. But beneath the towering, elegant frame was a fragility that would have horrified any human doctor. Zyron bones were hollow, built for a lighter homeworld gravity. Zyron's skin, shimmering now with a faint iridescent pearlescence, bruised if you looked at it wrong. Her large violet eyes swept the crowd of mingling diplomats, corporate barons, and decorated generals, cataloging every one of them as a potential threat, a potential ally, or, more often, both at once. She had grown up being told that a Zyron ruler's greatest weapon was patience, that hers was a species built to outlast, not to strike, and for most of her reign she had believed it without question. Tonight, standing 3 paces ahead of a man from a world that had never once had the luxury of patience, she was beginning to suspect there was more than one way to survive a knife fight, and that her ancestors had only ever learned one of them. She was a monarch balanced on the edge of a knife. Tonight she meant to sign a trade agreement that would keep her outer colonies from starving through the next long winter of the hegemony's calendar. And she knew, with the calm, resigned clarity of someone who had known it for months, that half of her own parliament wanted her dead for simply agreeing to sit at this table with humans. 3 paces behind her, perpetually folded into the long shadow thrown by a grand pillar, stood Jonathan Miller. He was not an imposing figure by galactic standards. No bioengineered exoplating rippled beneath his skin. No neural targeting optics glowed behind his eyes. No acid-spitting glands, no reinforced exoskeleton, no wings, no scales. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that did an admirable job of hiding the standard-issue tactical armor weave beneath it. His face was rugged, weathered by years spent in the outer rim doing work nobody wrote medals for, with a thin scar cutty. NG threw his left eyebrow that he'd stopped bothering to explain a long time ago. To the alien dignitaries whispering behind their crystal goblets, it was nothing short of scandalous that a sovereign of Cassandra's stature would entrust her life to a primate from a Class 3 death world. "They are staring again," Cassandra murmured. Her voice was a low, melodic hum that the station's universal interpreters rendered seamlessly into every language in the room. She didn't turn her head. She kept her serene smile fixed on the passing ambassador of the Orion Syndicate, who returned it with the practiced warmth of a man calculating exactly how much her goodwill was worth. "Let them stare, Your Majesty," Jonathan replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the string quartet. "Staring means they're not shooting. I've developed a real fondness for staring." A faint, weary sigh escaped Cassandra's lips. "Minister Harlan is approaching. He looks particularly smug this evening." "He usually does. I suspect he's gathered enough votes to challenge the Terran Agricultural Treaty in the next parliamentary cycle." Jonathan's pale blue eyes tracked the approaching figure without moving his head. Harlan was a fellow Zyron, draped in the opulent, flowing silks of the conservative faction, his smile a thing entirely devoid of warmth. The kind of smile a man wears when he already knows how the conversation is going to end. Jonathan adjusted his stance a fraction of an inch, muscles coiling with a tension no untrained eye would have caught. He didn't trust Harlan. He'd never trusted Harlan. The man smelled, even through the haze of expensive synthetic wine, of cheap political ambition wearing an expensive suit. "My esteemed queen," Harlan purred, coming to a halt a respectful distance away, though his eyes flicked toward Jonathan with poorly concealed contempt. "A glorious evening for the hegemony, is it not? Though I confess I find the atmosphere aboard this human construct terribly claustrophobic." "It is a marvel of engineering, Minister," Cassandra countered gracefully. "And the humans have been exceedingly gracious hosts. We would do well to appreciate their hospitality." "Hospitality," Harlan waved a dismissive hand, silk sleeve trailing. "Yes, though one does wonder why a monarch requires a human mercenary trailing her like a stray canid." "My royal guard," Cassandra said, and her tone dropped several careful degrees, "failed to detect the poison in my rations last month." Jonathan noticed the chemical discoloration in the nutrient paste from across the room before I had lifted the spoon. "He remains." Harlan's smile tightened into something closer to a grimace. "Of course, Your Majesty, forgive my impertinence. I merely worry for the image of the crown." He offered a shallow bow and withdrew, dissolving back into the crowd of silk and jewelry. Jonathan kept his eyes on Harlan's back until the minister vanished behind a cluster of aristocrats. "He knows something," Jonathan said quietly. "Harlan always knows something," Cassandra replied. "The question is whether he orchestrated it." The gala rolled on, a dizzying performance of wealth and rehearsed peace. Jonathan maintained his vigil, running a constant, silent audit of the room. He tracked the flight paths of the serving drones. He measured the structural stress lines on the great chandeliers overhead. He noted, without needing to think about it, the exact locations of all 6 emergency bulkheads and the fastest route to each one from where he stood. Humanity hadn't mastered the raw energy output of Zyron plasma shielding, and it hadn't come anywhere close to the telepathic resonance the Alpha Centaurans used to read a room before they'd even entered it. But humanity had perfected one art form beyond all rivals: paranoia, refined over centuries into a survival discipline. Jonathan's mind ran in the background like a second heartbeat, calculating the geometry of death in a room built for celebration. As the evening deepened, the ambient lighting dimmed by careful degrees, signaling the shift into the formal banquet phase of the summit. Cassandra turned from the observation window and smoothed the front of her crystalline gown. "I believe it is time we take our seats, Jonathan. The Prime Minister is preparing to speak." "Stay close," Jonathan said, falling into step exactly behind her left shoulder, the position he'd walked 10,000 times in training and a few dozen times for real. They moved together through the sea of alien nobility, the air growing thick with 100 competing cuisines and heavier perfumes. Jonathan's hand brushed, almost casually, against the inside of his jacket, the reassuring weight of his custom sidearm resting there. It was an archaic weapon by Galactic standards, firing solid depleted uranium slugs instead of superheated plasma. He preferred it that way. Plasma dissipated against energy shielding, scattered to pretty light and nothing else. Heavy metal moving at 3,000 feet per second didn't care how elegant your technology was. They reached the massive archway leading into the dining hall, and the station shuddered. It was a microscopic tremor, so subtle that most of the guests, deep in conversation, never even paused. But Jonathan felt it through the soles of his boots, a deep, resonant vibration that didn't belong anywhere in the steady, rhythmic hum of the station's life support. A gravitational anomaly. Someone, somewhere close, had just triggered a localized mass-dampening field. "Stop," Jonathan said, not loud, just sharp enough to stop Cassandra mid-stride. "Jonathan, what?" Every light in the grand concourse shattered at once. Total darkness swallowed the ballroom in an instant, and a heartbeat later the screams began, 100 different species, 100 different registers of panic, all colliding into one deafening wall of sound. The string quartet ground to a chaotic, discordant halt. This wasn't merely a loss of illumination. It was a tactical blindfold, and every combat instinct Jonathan owned recognized it as one before his conscious mind had finished the thought. He didn't need to think. Years of brutal training took over. He seized Cassandra's arm firm, but careful not to bruise her fragile physiology, and hauled her backward into the deep recess of the archway, putting solid durasteel plating between her spine and the room. "Shields up. Silence your breathing," he hissed into her ear, drawing the heavy ballistic pistol from his shoulder holster with his free hand. "The emergency backups aren't engaging," Cassandra whispered, and for the first time all evening her composure cracked, just slightly, a tremor threading through her voice. The station AI should have rebooted the grid within milliseconds. Localized EMP, tuned to standard galactic frequencies. "It blinded the grid on purpose," Jonathan said, reaching up to tap his temple and activate his tactical implant. Unlike the elegant, neural-laced interfaces the alien elite wore like jewelry, human combat implants were crude, invasive, and shielded against exactly this kind of attack. A sharp burning flare lit up behind his eyes as the optics booted. The pitch-black ballroom rendered itself into a high-contrast wireframe of heat signatures. He saw the crowd surging for the exits in a chaotic, glowing mass, and then his enhanced vision snagged on the anomalies. 4 figures moving completely against the grain of the panic. Cold. Absolute zero, invisible to any standard thermal scan, wrapped head to toe in dampening suits, and they were converging with terrifying, synchronized precision on the exact spot Cassandra had been standing 3 seconds earlier. "Assassins," Jonathan said, 4 of them coming our way." "Who sent them?" Her breathing had gone shallow. "Doesn't matter right now." He shifted his stance, planting his body squarely between the Queen and the threat. The 4 figures moved like liquid shadow, flowing around the screaming diplomats without so much as brushing a sleeve, silent as held breath. Leading them was a man carrying a long, curved blade that gave off no energy signature at all, a weapon that, to any scanner in the room, simply didn't exist. Jonathan didn't know his name yet, He would learn it soon enough. Gareth Cole. But he recognized the fluid, arrogant economy of motion immediately, the unmistakable signature of a top-tier corporate wetwork specialist, the kind who charged by the kill and never missed. Gareth was human, or had been once before the augmentations. Now he was something engineered to be the very best killer money could purchase, and Minister Harlan, Jonathan was already certain, had paid a great deal of money. Gareth reached the spot where Cassandra had been standing and stopped, head tilting a fraction as he registered that his target had vanished. He raised a hand, and his 3 subordinates fanned out without a word spoken between them. "Stay here, do not move," Jonathan whispered. Before the 4 of them could triangulate her position, he stepped out of the alcove, raised the pistol, and fired twice without offering so much as a warning. The crack of the ballistic weapon tore through the panicked dark like cannon fire. The assassin at Gareth's left flank never registered the sound before the depleted uranium rounds punched clean through his dampening armor, shattering his chest cavity and sending him flying backward into a table of crystal glassware in a spray of shards and blue blood. The remaining 3 locked onto the muzzle flash instantly. "Contact," one of them barked, a synthetic modulated voice cutting through the chaos. Gareth didn't flinch. He closed the distance in a blur, terrifyingly fast, while the other 2 assassins peeled off to flank, drawing advanced pulse pistols from their hips. Jonathan dropped to one knee as twin beams of blue plasma scorched the SB. Ace where his head had been a half-second earlier, singeing his hair and turning the archway behind him white-hot. He rolled right, firing blind to suppress the flankers. His 3rd shot found a knee, and the depleted uranium slug took the alien's leg off in a geyser of luminous fluid. But Gareth was already on him. The curved blade came down in a single fluid arc. Jonathan brought his pistol up in a standard close-quarters deflection, and the blade didn't clash against the metal. It sliced through the barrel as if it were warm butter, severing the weapon and leaving Jonathan holding a useless grip. Monomolecular edge, his brain registered instantly, a shield breaker. He threw the ruined pistol at Gareth's face and dodged backward, barely clearing a horizontal slash that would have opened him from hip to ribs. The tip caught the edge of his kinetic weave jacket anyway, slicing a clean line across his chest and drawing a sharp, immediate line of fire and pain. "You're outclassed, guard dog," Gareth said, stepping into the light of a flickering emergency beacon. His face was pale, his eyes entirely black, lacking sclera, a signature side effect of aggressive neurological overclocking. "You're making a mess of my suit, pal," Jonathan grunted, dropping into a defensive stance, fists raised. It was a ridiculous posture to take against a man wielding a weapon that broke the laws of ordinary physics, but it was the only option left on the table. Gareth chuckled, a dry, rasping sound with no real humor in it. A human defending a Zyron monarch. The galaxy has truly lost its sense of order. "How do you know my name?" Jonathan asked, shifting his weight, watching the footwork. "I studied your file, Miller. Former orbital dropshock trooper, honorable discharge after the Ceades campaign. Tough, loyal, but flesh and bone. I have carbon fiber interlacing through my muscle tissue and a processor that reads your movement before you've finished making it. Die with dignity or die screaming. Your choice." "I pick option 3, Jonathan said and lunged. He threw a feint with his left, a textbook jab meant to draw the blade before dropping low to sweep Gareth's legs out. Gareth didn't even bother blocking the jab. He simply pivoted, let Jonathan's momentum carry him forward, and brought the pommel of the sword crashing down into the back of Jonathan's neck. White-hot agony exploded through his skull. His vision strobed. His equilibrium shattered and he went down hard, face first onto the obsidian floor. His ears rang with a high, keening whine that swallowed the ambient panic of the room whole. He tried to push himself up. His left arm refused to answer. Gareth stepped over him without breaking stride, without so much as bothering to finish the job. To an augmented killer, a broken human was no longer a variable worth solving for. "Cassandra," Gareth called into the darkness, voice mild, almost bored. "I know you're in the alcove. Come out. If you make me come get you, I'll start dissecting your guard dog piece by piece." Jonathan forced his head up, tasting copper. Through blurring vision he watched Queen Cassandra, terrified, but somehow still holding her chin high, still every inch a sovereign, step out from the shadows of the archway. "Leave him," she said, and her voice remarkably did not shake. "Your contract is with me." "Indeed it is, Your Highness," Gareth said and smiled. In one fluid motion, he crossed the remaining distance, seized her by the shoulder, spun her, and pressed the edge of the monomolecular blade directly against her throat. Cold steel pressed against the sovereign's delicate throat. The monomolecular edge, sharp enough to sever atoms cleanly, without so much as a whisper of friction, hovered less than a millimeter from Cassandra's carotid. A single twitch of Gareth's wrist would end a 3,000-year dynasty and plunge the entire Zyron hegemony into civil war before the sun rose over Geneva orbital. Death was milliseconds away. Jonathan was on his hands and knees, blood dripping from his nose in a slow, steady patter onto the pristine floor. His left arm hung dead at his side. His chest burned where the blade had opened it, and his skull throbbed in time with his pulse. He was beaten, physically outmatched, outgunned, outmaneuvered by a predator built specifically to be better than him in every measurable way. Gareth looked down at the broken human struggling to draw breath, and something like satisfaction crossed his pale, black-eyed face. The remaining wounded assassin limped over, weapon trained loosely on the huddled, terrified crowd, securing the perimeter. Minister Harlan's plan, it seemed, had worked flawlessly. "Look at him, Your Majesty," Gareth murmured into Cassandra's ear, his black eyes fixed on Jonathan the entire time. "This is what you placed your faith in, a creature of mud and arrogance. Humanity loves to boast about its resilience, its indomitable spirit, but at the end of the day, physics wins, biology wins, he is weak, and because he is weak, you die tonight." Any normal bodyguard would have begged, bargained, offered his own life in trade, or simply frozen, paralyzed by the certainty of failure. Instead, Jonathan Miller stopped struggling. He sat back on his heels. He looked up at Gareth with a face painted in his own blood, his breathing ragged and uneven, and he lowered his good hand to rest on his knee, threw his head back, and erupted into genuine, booming laughter. It wasn't a chuckle. It wasn't the hollow, hysterical giggle of a man who'd cracked under pressure. It was a deep, rolling belly laugh that bounced off the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom, unmistakably, unnervingly real, the sound of a man who had just watched the funniest thing he'd seen all year. It was so wildly out of place in a hostage negotiation that the surviving diplomats, still huddled beneath overturned tables, froze mid-sob to stare. Gareth's confident smile flickered. His brow furrowed a fraction of a degree, the closest thing his overclocked face had left to genuine confusion. The blade pressed a hair tighter. A single bead of iridescent blue blood welled at Cassandra's throat. "What is so funny, ape?" Gareth snapped, and for the first time that evening there was an edge of something almost human in his synthetic calm. Jonathan coughed, spat a glob of blood onto the polished floor, and wiped his mouth with the back of his good hand. "I'm sorry," he wheezed, shaking his head, a grin spreading slowly across his battered face. "I'm really sorry. It's just, I read your file too, Gareth Cole, or should I say, Subject 89 Alpha." Gareth's eye twitched, sharp and involuntary. "Shut up." "You spent your whole life upgrading yourself," Jonathan continued, his voice regaining its gravel, refusing the order outright. "Carbon fiber muscle, neural processors, subdermal plating. You built yourself into the perfect machine. And somewhere along the way, you forgot what it actually means to be human." "I evolved," Gareth hissed. "You stayed a primate." "Yeah, maybe. Jonathan laughed softly, pushing himself up onto his feet with slow, deliberate effort, swaying but staying up, his good leg taking the weight. But because you rely on all that expensive tech, you forgot the single most basic rule of human combat. And what rule is that? Never bring a knife to a dead man's switch. Gareth's black eyes narrowed. Bluff, your weapon is destroyed. You're carrying no explosives. My optics would have flagged a detonator the second you walked into this room. You're right, Jonathan said, taking a slow step forward. No explosives, no detonator. But you see, Gareth, when my government assigned me to protect the Queen, they didn't just hand me a suit and a gun and wish me luck. They know Zyron politics. They knew someone like Harlan would eventually hire a ghost like you. They knew if an assassin ever got past the perimeter, he'd use dampening fields, EMPs, and shield breakers to slip past alien security. Another step. Gareth pressed the blade harder against Cassandra's throat. Take one more step, Miller, and I take her head. Do it, Jonathan said, and every scrap of humor drained out of his voice, replaced by something flat and cold as vacuum. Cassandra gasped, her wide violet eyes snapping to Jonathan's face in a flash of raw, uncomprehending betrayal. Gareth hesitated. His hyperfast processor screamed through 1,000 risk calculations a second, and every single one of them was flashing red for reasons it couldn't yet articulate. Why was the human sacrificing his own principle? I said, Jonathan repeated, louder now, the sheer volume making the wounded assassin flinch, do it. Cut her throat, Gareth, let's see what happens next. Gareth didn't move. His neural processor screamed alarms he didn't have a name for yet because it had never seen a human's heart rate do this before, not spiking with panic, the way it should, the way every simulation predicted. Steadying, slowing, going calm. You're confused, Jonathan said and smiled, a feral, bloody baring of teeth. Let me walk you through it. You brought a monomolecular blade. Zero friction, zero heat, an elegant weapon built to slice clean through energy shielding. Zyron design, top of the line, but you forgot one very important detail about where you're standing tonight. Gareth's black eyes flicked involuntarily to the ceiling, then back down. Neva Orbital is a Terran station, Jonathan said. It runs on a human military AI called Archangel, and Archangel is blind right now. You knocked its optics and thermal sensors offline with that EMP. But Archangel is a paranoid AI, built by paranoid engineers, and it has a tertiary backup system nobody outside a very short list of clearance levels even knows exists. A chemical sniffer, wired directly into the life support vents. It doesn't look for weapons, Gareth. It looks for biological signatures. Meaningless, Gareth said, but there was the faintest crack in his voice now. Is it? Jonathan laughed, low and humorless. When you sliced my chest open, you didn't just cut fabric. You drew human blood. When you cracked me across the skull, I bled on this floor. Right now there's roughly 4 ounces of my O-negative aerosolizing in the ambient air of this room. And I've got a very specific, very expensive genetically engineered enzyme running through my veins, courtesy of the Terran military. The kind of thing you only get issued if your entire job description is standing between a VIP and a knife. Gareth's eyes widened just slightly as the pieces finally clicked into place. Yeah, Jonathan said, watching the realization land. It's a biological tag. The second Archangel detects that specific enzyme signature in the air, it triggers a code black. It knows a Terran VIP Guardian has been critically wounded, and it doesn't need cameras to find me. It triangulates the chemical emission down to the meter. Kill him, Gareth screamed at his surviving subordinate, but it was already too late. The emergency lights overhead didn't flicker back on. They shifted all at once to a harsh, blinding crimson red, and a mechanized voice, flat, absolute, utterly without emotion, rolled through the entire concourse. Code Black protocol activated. Lethal force authorized. Targeting locked. You think you're fast, Gareth. Jonathan said quietly, staring straight into those black, empty eyes. "Let's see you outrun an automated point defense turret." The ceiling panels directly above Gareth and Cassandra tore open with a shriek of tearing metal, and two twin-barreled rotary cannons, the kind normally reserved for shredding incoming micrometeors outside the hull, dropped into firing position. Gareth understood, in a single frozen instant, that if he moved that blade even a centimeter to finish the Queen, the turrets would vaporize him where he stood. But the machine calculated hostages. It wouldn't fire while there was a live risk of hitting Cassandra. That was doctrine. That was protocol. That was stalemate, Gareth snarled, holding the blade perfectly, surgically still. "They can't shoot me without hitting her." "You really didn't read the whole file, did you?" Jonathan said, almost gently. "I didn't program Archangel to protect the Queen, Gareth. I programmed it to protect me." And then he lunged directly into the razor edge of the blade. Gareth panicked a fraction of a second, no more, but it was enough. As Jonathan's body slammed into his outstretched arm, pure instinct yanked the blade backward to defend against the collision, pulling it clean off Cassandra's throat. For one shattering millisecond, the connection between assassin and hostage broke entirely. Cassandra was clear. The roar of the rotary cannons was deafening, a localized thunderstorm of depleted uranium screaming out at 4,000 rounds a minute. Jonathan hit the obsidian floor a half-second before the airspace above him turned into a river of superheated kinetic annihilation. The Aegis-pattern CIWS turrets didn't fire lasers, didn't fire plasma. They fired solid mass, engineered to shred incoming asteroid fragments, and against a biological target, even one as heavily armored and cybernetically reinforced as Gareth Cole. The results were instantaneous, absolute, and final. His processor, capable of running 1,000,000 combat variables a second, never had time to register that his leverage was gone before he simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a hail of uranium that cratered the reinforced durasteel floor beneath him and sent shards of obsidian screaming outward like shrapnel. The remaining subordinate assassin, watching his squad leader erased from reality in under a second, dropped his pulse pistol and fell to his knees, hands raised, surrendering without a sound. The turrets tracked him, painted him with targeting lasers, and held their fire. The threat to the biological VIP was contained. Silence slammed back into the concourse, broken only by the mechanical hiss of the retracting turrets cooling down, and the muffled, terrified sobbing of dignitaries still huddled beneath their overturned tables. "Jonathan!" Cassandra's voice cut through the ringing in his ears before anything else did. She dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the way the dark, spreading pool beneath him soaked into the pristine fabric of her gown. Jonathan groaned and rolled onto his back. The left side of his body felt wired into a live socket, and dark spots swam across his vision. He'd thrown himself directly into the path of the monomolecular blade to force Gareth's hand off the Queen, and the assassin's reflexive jerk had carved a deep, clean crescent through his shoulder armor and into the muscle beneath. "I'm all right, Your Majesty," Jonathan rasped, coughing. "Just need a minute for the painkillers to catch up." His suit's in. Internal biomonitors were already flooding his system with synthetic adrenaline and coagulants, but the sheer physical toll of the fight was finally catching up with him in one long, delayed wave. "You absolute fool," Cassandra whispered, her violet eyes wide with terror and something closer to awe than anger. Her trembling fingers hovered over the jagged laceration in his shoulder, afraid to press down. "You threw yourself onto a shield breaker." "Worked though, didn't it?" He offered a weak, lopsided grin, teeth stained pink. "Secure the perimeter. That hostile goes into custody," Commander Reynolds barked from across the room, pointing a gauntleted hand at the kneeling surviving assassin. Two Marines hauled the alien to his feet, cinching magnetic restraints around his wrists. Medics swarmed Jonathan a heartbeat later, deploying a portable stasis field around his upper torso to arrest the blood loss and prevent nerve degradation from the monomolecular cut. As the medics worked, the station's main power grid finally rebooted. The luminescent spheres flickered back to life one by one, casting harsh, honest light across the carnage. The Grand Concourse, a masterpiece of interstellar diplomacy an hour ago, now looked exactly like what it was, a battlefield. From the crowd of shell-shocked diplomats, Minister Harlan emerged, his silk robes slightly rumpled, his face arranged into an expression of exaggerated horror. "My queen," he cried, rushing forward, flanked by two of his personal Zyron guards. "By the stars, the humans have allowed this atrocity. I warned you about their primitive security. Are you harmed?" Cassandra rose slowly, her regal composure folding back over her like armor. "I am unharmed, Minister, thanks entirely to my human guard." Harlan's eyes flicked to Jonathan, being hoisted onto an anti-grav stretcher by the Terran medics. A brief, almost imperceptible flash of frustration crossed his elegant features before he smoothed it away. A tragic failure of their vaunted technology nonetheless. Hired killers bypassing their sensors entirely. "We must leave this death trap at once, Your Majesty. I will summon the Royal Dreadnought." "Hold on a second, Harlan," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the murmurs with more strength than his body had any right to produce. He pushed the medic's hand away and forced himself upright on the hovering stretcher. "Mr. Miller, you need to lie down," the lead medic urged. Jonathan waved him off, pale blue eyes locking onto the minister. "How did you know they bypassed the sensors, Harlan?" Harlan blinked, offering a patronizing smile. "It is obvious, is it not? They entered undetected in the dark." "No," Jonathan said, tapping the side of his own skull. "The EMP knocked out the lights and the grid, but the assassins were wearing thermal dampening suits, a very specific modification, built to bypass Zyron biometric scanners, not Terran ones, which means whoever hired them handed them the wrong architectural schematics for this station entirely." "I am a politician, not a security expert human," Harlan scoffed, turning back toward Cassandra. "Your Majesty, surely you will not permit this mercenary to address a minister of the hegemony in such a tone." "Let him speak," Cassandra said, and her voice dropped the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. Jonathan leaned forward, fighting down a wave of nausea. "You see, Harlan, humans are paranoid, but we're also obsessive data hoarders. When the hegemony agreed to this summit, my government didn't just run background checks. They deployed a legacy financial intelligence framework, originally built by a firm called Palantir back on Earth, centuries ago, to trace every encrypted transaction moving through the Orion Syndicate's dark markets over the last 6 months. Harlan's patronizing smile began, very slowly, to freeze in place. Financial transactions. What could this possibly have to do with an assassination attempt? "Everything," Jonathan said, a feral grin spreading across his bloodied face. "Gareth Cole didn't work cheap." He raised his voice, and it carried across the concourse, and every eye in the room, alien and human alike, fixed on the bleeding man on the stretcher. An augmented killer of his caliber costs millions in standard galactic credit, and you can't move that kind of money without leaving a footprint, not when human financial networks get involved somewhere along the chain. Harlan drew himself up to his full towering height, iridescent skin flushing a darker shade of violet. "Are you accusing me, a minister of the High Council, of funding this attack? This is an outrage. I have diplomatic immunity, and I demand this primate be arrested for slander." "You're right about the immunity," Commander Reynolds said, stepping forward, his power armor groaning as he crossed his arms. "Terran authorities can't touch you for crimes committed under hegemony jurisdiction, but you're wrong about the slander." Jonathan tapped a command into the holographic interface strapped to his good wrist. A massive, three-dimensional ledger unfolded in the air above the ruined dining table, ignoring the shattered crystal and spilled wine entirely. We humans have a long, ugly history of corporate warfare, Jonathan said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. Long before we ever joined the galactic stage, we perfected the art of the financial paper trail. The money that hired Gareth Cole was routed through 14 different shell corporations across the Cygnes sector. Genuinely brilliant obfuscation by Zyron standards, but your accountants made one fatal mistake. Harlan stared at the glowing blue numbers, hands beginning, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. They routed the final payment through a banking subsidiary owned by J.P. Morgan Stark, Jonathan said, pronouncing the ancient Terran corporate name with the reverence of a man quoting scripture. You used a human bank to pay a human assassin to kill a monarch on a human space station. Do you have any idea how insulted our intelligence agencies were when they found that thread? Cassandra studied the projected data, her sharp mind translating the routing codes almost instantly. There, buried beneath layer after layer of proxy signatures, sat the seal of Harlan's private estate, tied directly to the escrow account that had funded the kill order. We knew about the hit 3 days ago, Jonathan admitted, leaning back against the stretcher, exhaustion finally cracking through his voice. You knew, Cassandra turned on him, shock plain on her face, and you said nothing. If we'd arrested him before he struck, Jonathan said, meeting her eyes, Harlan would have claimed it was a Terran fabrication designed to destabilize your government. He'd have used the arrest to rally the conservative faction, declare humanity an enemy of the hegemony, and taken your throne out from under you anyway. We needed him to commit to it, Your Majesty. We needed him to spring his own trap. Harlan took a stumbling step backward, eyes darting frantically toward the exits, and finding them already sealed by Commander Reynolds' Goliath-armored Marines. You used me as bait, Cassandra said slowly, and her voice trembled not with fear this time, but with a strange, profound awe at the sheer, cold audacity of the strategy that had just been laid bare in front of her. With respect, Your Majesty, Jonathan said, I'm your bodyguard. My job is to protect your life. My government's job is to protect your reign, and the agricultural treaty you came here to sign guarantees food for billions of your people through the winter. We couldn't let a parasite like Harlan burn that down over his own pride, so we let him play his hand, and we made sure I was standing exactly where I needed to be when the knife finally came out. Harlan spun toward his own personal guards. Shoot them. Shoot the humans. We are leaving now. The Zyron guards didn't move. They looked instead at the projected financial data hanging in the air, data that displayed high treason against the crown in glowing, undeniable blue, and then they looked at Queen Cassandra. Cassandra straightened her posture, and the full, crushing weight of her royal authority radiated outward from her fragile frame like heat off a reactor core. Minister Harlan, she said, her voice ringing like struck crystal through the silent hall, by the laws of the First Dynasty, you are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your immunity. Guards, place this traitor in irons. Harlan's own guards seized his arms and forced him to his knees on the obsidian floor. He sputtered curses in the old Zyron tongue, but a stasis gag was clamped over his jaw before he could finish the sentence. Take him to the Terran brig, Cassandra ordered. He will await trial before the High Council. As Harlan was dragged away in absolute disgrace, the tension in the room finally broke, spilling over into chaotic, overlapping chatter as the surviving diplomats scrambled to recalculate their political alliances, now that the conservative faction had been decapitated in a single devastating stroke of human cunning. Cassandra ignored all of it. She crossed to Jonathan's anti-grav stretcher, where the medics had finished applying surgical stasis foam to his shoulder, leaving him pale, battered, and remarkably, stubbornly alive. She reached out and brushed her fingertips gently against the uninjured side of his face. The golden light of the restored concourse caught the faint trace of tears standing in her violet eyes. You laughed, she whispered, barely audible over the low hum of the medical equipment. When he held that blade to my throat, when all seemed lost, You looked a cybernetic monster in the eye and you laughed. Jonathan managed a weak chuckle, wincing as it pulled at his ribs. Told you, Your Majesty, I prefer it when they stare, but when they try to kill. Well, somebody had to let Gareth know he was the punchline of a joke he didn't even realize he was standing inside of. You humans, Cassandra said, shaking her head slowly, disbelief and something warmer threading through her voice in equal measure. You do not fight like other creatures. You weaponize your own blood. You weaponize your economy. You turn your own mortality into a trap for anyone foolish enough to threaten what you've sworn to protect. Class 3 death world, Jonathan said and smiled, his eyelids beginning to droop as the combat sedatives finally, mercifully took hold. We don't get plasma shields. We don't get telepathy. We just get grit, spite, and really, really good accountants. Cassandra signaled the medics forward, and they eased the stretcher toward the trauma bay, her hand resting on its edge the entire way, unwilling to let go. Rest now, Jonathan Miller, the queen of the Zyron hegemony said softly. When you wake, you will find your contract permanently extended, and I believe I owe your government a very favorable signature on a certain agricultural treaty. Jonathan didn't answer. He'd already drifted into a deep chemical sleep, secure in the one certainty that mattered. He had done his job. He woke 11 hours later in the station's trauma bay, his shoulder knitted with synthetic graft tissue that itched worse than any bullet wound he'd ever taken, to find Cassandra seated in the chair beside his bed, still wearing the same crystalline gown, now cleaned of blood, as though she had refused to leave the room long enough to change. You didn't have to wait here, Jonathan rasped. I am aware, Cassandra said, of what I did and did not have to do. She set down the data slate she'd been reading and folded her hands in her lap with the same rigid, deliberate composure she wore into every negotiation. The agricultural treaty was signed at dawn, by the way, unanimously. It turns out nothing unites a parliament quite like watching their most vocal dissenting minister dragged away in irons for treason. Silver linings. The Prime Minister sends his compliments. He has also, apparently, asked your government whether Terran security consultants might be made available to the rest of the hegemony's outer systems, on a paid basis. A faint, dry note crept into her voice. You may have started a trend, Mr. Miller. Don't let it go to your head, Jonathan said, and managed something close to a real smile this time. I'm still just one guy who got lucky. You are, Cassandra said, the single most heavily insured individual in the Zyron hegemony as of 6 hours ago, and I do not believe for a moment that luck had anything to do with what happened in that ballroom. She studied him for a long moment, violet eyes unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? About the informant? About the 3 days you spent watching Harlan build his own gallows and saying nothing? Jonathan considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things people actually bothered to ask him. Because you had to walk into that room and be a queen, not a woman bracing for an ambush. You needed to be real in there, really calm, really gracious, really unafraid, because half that room would have smelled a performance a mile off. I couldn't give you the truth and the composure both. So I kept the truth and gave you the only gift that was actually mine to give. Cassandra was quiet for a long moment. Then, very softly, that is either the most selfless thing anyone has ever done for me, or the most arrogant. With me it's usually both, Jonathan said. Ask anyone. She almost laughed, a small, surprised sound, quickly suppressed, though not quickly enough to hide it. Rest, Jonathan Miller. The hegemony has a great deal of gratitude to express, and I suspect you are going to find that considerably more exhausting than the assassin was. Yeah, Jonathan said, already feeling the pull of sleep tugging at him again. That tracks. Above them, the grand concourse of Geneva Orbital slowly settled back into order. Automated cleaning drones hummed to life, scrubbing shattered glass and blood from the obsidian floor. But the galaxy, watching through 100 diplomatic feeds relayed back to 100 different homeworlds, would never quite be the same again. The alien elite had witnessed, firsthand, the terrifying reality of human protection. That humanity did not merely defend the people it loved with brute force and kinetic weapons, but with a ruthless, calculated, and terrifyingly precise machinery of survival, built from centuries of learning to endure a planet that had never once made it easy. And somewhere out among the stars, word would spread, quietly and completely, that if an assassin ever again dared to put a blade to the throat of someone under human protection, they would learn, in the last handful of seconds they had left, exactly why the galaxy was slowly, carefully, learning to fear. The quiet, fragile-looking primates from Earth. If you enjoyed this deep dive into humanity's raw, uncompromising resilience against the galaxy's worst, smash that like button and share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY tales, intense galactic dramas, and twists you never see coming until they're already standing behind you. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Jonathan's shoes? Stay strong, stay human. See you in the next one.